The following story takes place between the years 927 and 1066. What you're about to watch is the fourth episode of our series on the history of England. If you're the kind of person who likes the history nice and tidy and in chronological order, perhaps you should watch the first 3 videos before delving into this one. If you've already done that, or just want to get on with this fascinating period, then, well, let's get on with it. In the year 927, King Æthelstan became ruler of all England after conquering the Kingdom of Jorvik. He then defeated the King of Scotland, Strathclyde, and the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Bamburgh. Even the Welsh monarchs paid him an annual tribute and recognised Æthelstan as their overlord. And to this day, the Welsh absolutely love being ruled over by the English.
You were being sarcastic.
This first king of the English devoted significant efforts to improving the administration and laws governing the country. He reorganised the entire territory into shires, each headed by an ealdorman. These counties in turn were divided into districts or hundreds, and those contained the towns or cities. Everything seemed to be going just hunky-dory for the Anglo-Saxons, except for the fact that there still remained many Nordic people living in the country, and they quite fancied regaining control of their former territories. So, the faction of those Nordics who had settled in Dublin, led by Olaf Guthrisson, allied with the Britons of the Kingdom of Strathclyde and King Constantine II of Scotland, or the Kingdom of Alba. And that's when the shit hit the fan, leading to the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. Æthelstan and his brother Edmund fought the coalition and squashed it, thus regaining control over all of Northumbria. In addition, this battle proved a catalyst that united the royalties of Wessex and Mercia against a common enemy. 2 years later, Æthelstan died single and childless, so his brother Edmund the Magnificent took the crown. During his reign, the Danes, headed by Olaf Guthrisson, took back the Kingdom of Jorvik, but they didn't manage to establish their control very firmly, and by 944, Edmund had reconquered it.
Mine.
After Edmund came the third sibling, Eadred, who is famous for his fight against the Norwegian King Erik Bloodaxe. Well, actually he wasn't a king anymore because he was so violent and bloodthirsty, even for a Viking, which is saying something, that he was run out of Norway. This piece of work ended up in Northumbria, and by about 947 he had taken control of the territory. King Eadred went over there, defeated him, sent him back the way he came, and thought that would be the end of it, but Eric was a hard man to get rid of. A few years later, in 952, he returned and again managed to take over the English north.
Well, it's Groundhog Day.
Which he ruled for 2 years, until the Northumbrians also got fed up with his wicked ways and kicked him out. The key point here is that all of the Northumbrian territory, which included the Kingdom of Jorvik, was then definitively incorporated into England. The following English king was Edwy Allfair, son of Edmund, who was more interested in skirt affairs than state affairs, if you know what I mean. In fact, according to the legend, King Edwig's salacious escapades began right from the day of his coronation. The rumour goes that, at one point during the celebrations, the king disappeared, and so Dunstan, Abbot of Glastonbury, went looking everywhere for him. It took a while, but eventually he found His Royal Highness in bed, playing Hide the Sceptre with a noble lady named Elfgafu, and also her mother, Æthelgafu. As you can see, the tabloid-worthy affairs of British royalty go way back. Anyway, Dunstan first dressed down the king and then made him get dressed up and attend the banquet. But Elfgafu's mother never forgave the abbot for interrupting their private coronation. She kept plotting against him and eventually managed to get him exiled from the kingdom for a few years, until the king passed away in 959. The crown then went to Edgar the Peaceful, and his reign was just that, peaceful. He spent a lot of money rebuilding old monasteries and constructing new ones, and supported the Benedictine reform. He ensured that the clergy received excellent training, and so it's not surprising that many bishops and monks later became part of the Witan, or Wittengemot, or Royal Council of English Royalty. Edgar died in 975 and was succeeded by his two children. First was Edward the Martyr, who only lasted 3 years. Apparently he was a very violent man and attracted much hate, and perhaps that's why he was assassinated by supporters of his 10-year-old half-brother Ethelred II, or Ethelred the Unready, who thus became the new king. Ethelred the Unready ruled for more than 30 years, but with a name like that you can probably guess that he wasn't a great monarch. In fact, he is generally considered to be one of the most disastrous kings in English history, even more disastrous than Frederick the Fuck-Up. Okay, I just made that one up.
Cheeky.
Let's have a look at this period so you can understand why this was such an unfortunate time for the Anglo-Saxons. First of all, we must travel to Denmark, to the domains of King Harald Gormson, better known as Harold Bluetooth, whom the wireless technology was named after. King Harold had a grand vision of imposing Christianity throughout his kingdom, but it didn't turn out quite the way he hoped, because his own son, Sewin Forkbeard, was totally against the idea, to the point that he killed his father and took the throne in 986. The supporters of dead King Harold fled to England, and there they fought against King Æthelred II with remarkable success. So much so that the news reached Sewin, who then decided that killing Englishmen sounded like his kind of party, and off he went with his army. This led to the Battle of Maldon in 991, which ended with a great victory for the Viking invaders, commanded by Olaf Tryggvason, ally of Sewin and future King of Norway. It also marked the last time that anything exciting happened in Maldon.
Ouch.
From here onwards, the English forces fell like dominoes. The system of defensive boroughs failed, lacking adequate support from the inept Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred, who basically just hid away like a proper coward. When the situation became critical, Ethelred tried to pay the Scandinavians to leave him alone, but this strategy achieved the exact opposite, as it made the invaders greedy for more gold, and the fighting soon resumed. To make things worse, the Vikings obtained the support of the Normans, who allowed them to operate from their ports in northern France. In an attempt to break up this alliance, in the year 1001, Ethelred II married Princess Emma, sister to Richard II, Duke of Normandy. This was the start of a closer relationship between the English and the Norman crowns, which, as we mentioned in the previous episode, would later become central to future events. Then, in 1002, King Ethelred II was told that the Danes living in England were plotting to assassinate him, and so he ordered them all to be killed. The result was a complete bloodbath, which has come to be known as the St. Brice Day Massacre, and in which Sewin Forkbeard's own sister was also murdered. This infuriated the Danish king, who retaliated with a new raid.
See, now you made him mad!
In 1003, Sewin's troops disembarked at East Anglia, and although they were initially defeated at the walls of Thetford, the Danish onslaught continued over the following years. The English tried to build a fleet to fight them on the seas, but half of it, commanded by a nobleman called Wulfnoth Kild, deserted and began sacking coastal villages. And then when the other half of the fleet went to chase them, it ended up being destroyed by a storm. Basically, it was a total shit show. Seeing this mess, Sewin Forkbeard realised that England was even weaker than he had imagined, and so he decided to mount a full-scale invasion. In 1013, a new Danish fleet arrived at Kent, and city after city fell or surrendered to the Vikings. They took Northumbria, the 5 old boroughs of the Danelaw, Oxford, Winchester, and eventually reached the gates of London.
They're in London.
London, okay.
The Anglo-Saxons were sensible and surrendered the city, whereupon Æthelred II fled to Normandy with his children, Edward and Alfred, leaving the Danes in control of England for a turbulent period of 30 years. But before we start delving into that, remember that we live for your subscriptions, likes, comments and shares. King Sewin Forkbeard wasn't able to enjoy his great conquest for very long, because he died at his camp in Gainsborough in 1014. His son Harold II took over the Danish throne, while his younger brother, Cnut II, or Cnut the Great, continued Sweyn's invasion and was even proclaimed as King of England by the Danish troops living in Northumbria. Among other things, Cnut is famous for his formidable personal guard, a corps of about 2,000 badass warriors wielding enormous battle axes known as the housecarls. Meanwhile, over in northern France, Ethelred II hadn't given up on reclaiming his throne. He obtained the support of the Witan, returned to England and fought Cnut. However, several English nobles who saw the writing on the wall decided to join the Danish side, and this shifted the tide until Æthelred was forced to retreat to London. The city was besieged, and there he died, mostly alone, and was buried at Old St Paul's Cathedral. But Æthelred's death was not the end of this mess, as his son Edmund II, or Edmund Ironside, kept it going with the support of allies like Uhtred the Bold, Earl of Bamburgh. As an interesting aside, one of the protagonists of the series The Last Kingdom is mostly based on him. It is thought that Uhtred travelled to see Cnut with the intention of joining him, but he was assassinated on the way there. Nobody really knows by who.
It was an accident.
By this point, the English defenders were completely unable to stop the Danish advance. The city of London was surrounded, and although Edmund Ironside managed to escape and fight another day, he was eventually defeated at the Battle of Æthelstan in 1016, after which he agreed to split up the country. King Edmund would keep Wessex, while Cnut would have the rest of England north of the Thames. And so they lived happily ever... no, just kidding. Edmund appeared dead mysteriously a few weeks later, and the Witan elected Cnut the Great, King of all England. Not that they really had much choice. Cnut then made two classic moves of any new foreign king. First, he converted to the local religion, in this case Christianity, and then he married the widow of the former king, in this case Emma of Normandy, seeking to legitimise the throne for his descendants. Later, when his brother Harold II died in 1018, Cnut also inherited Denmark, and it seems that the guy preferred his homeland, so he gradually paid less and less attention to England. The territory became divided into 4 counties: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria and East Anglia, whose rulers, or ealdorman, came to be known just as earls, which incidentally comes from the Scandinavian term jarl, meaning chieftain. These titles were given to nobles with Danish roots, except in the case of Wessex, where it went to a Saxon named Godwin. Remember Wulfnoth Kjeld, the naval commander we mentioned earlier, who rebelled and took half of the English fleet? Well, this was his son, who became a very powerful earl and will soon feature prominently in this story.
Oh, he's gonna get in trouble!
In the year 1027, Cnut went to war against Norway and Sweden and conquered a large part of those kingdoms. As you can see on this map, he was a lord of a huge domain. But then Cnut died in 1035, and that set off the first of multiple succession free-for-alls. If you recall, Cnut had married Æthelred's widow, Emma of Normandy, who bore him a child named Cnut III, or Harthacnut. However, it turned out that the cheeky Cnut had also fathered another son with a Danish lass called Elskafu, a boy known as Harold Harefoot, and upon Cnut's death, while Harthacnut was tied up dealing with the revolt in their Scandinavian homeland, this Harold made a play for the English throne. Around the same time, Alfred, the exiled son of Emma and Æthelred II, arrived in England from Normandy to visit his mother and was promptly assassinated by order of Earl Godwin because he suspected that Alfred would stir up trouble seeking to claim the crown or something like that. Soon afterwards, in 1040, Harold Harefoot fell ill and died, leaving the path to the English throne clear for his half-brother and legitimate heir, Harthacnut, who turned out to be a very unpopular king because he set extortionate taxes. Fortunately, he didn't last very long either, as he died just a couple of years later in 1042 after getting lethally drunk during a banquet. Up in the north, the kingdom of Alpa was ruled by a lad named Macbeth. He would serve as inspiration for Shakespeare's play, which is quite historically inaccurate. Macbeth reached the throne after having Duncan I, his predecessor, killed, and he also fought against Siward, Earl of Northumbria, when he attempted to invade Scotland. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of England in northern France, there was a Duchy of Normandy, where Duke Robert I lived happily at his castle of Falaise. It appears that he maintained a romance with a young commoner named Herleva, who bore him a son, and although they probably called the boy Gwilliam, he is generally known to history as William the Conqueror, or William the Bastard, depending on who you ask.
We're the same person.
Then, in 1035, Robert travelled to Jerusalem, but unfortunately he died on his way back, making William the new Duke of Normandy. His initial years were full of intrigue and murders, including a conspiracy plotted by his very own cousin, Guy of Burgundy, Count of Brionne. William was forced to flee Normandy and ended up seeking refuge at the court of the French king Henry I, who became his protector and overlord, and later helped him to reclaim his duchy after they triumphed at the Battle of Val-es-Dunes. William then settled at Caen, where he built himself a castle and, for a short while, lived peacefully with his wife Matilda of Flanders. However, his life would soon take a turn, as the gods of history had marked him as a key figure in their game of 4D chess.
I have been chosen.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, we must return to the British side of the story. After Harthacnut's death, the English crown returned to the House of Wessex, to Edward the Confessor, who had spent several years exiled in Normandy with his mother's family. He arrived in England and was crowned as king, but as fate would have it, he would be the last monarch of the Anglo-Saxon House of Wessex. At that time, the king had absolute power, although he was advised by the Witter. Edward abandoned the old system of counties, creating new ones, and it's worth noting the figure of Shire Reeve, a representative of the king in those counties, who was in charge of collecting taxes, imparting justice, maintaining public roads, protecting the peace, and calling the shire levies. This position of Shire Reeve later evolved into the modern term sheriff.
Legal.
Since we're talking about Edward the Confessor, we must mention his troubled relationship with Godwin, Earl of Wessex. The reason behind their bad blood was that Godwin, as we mentioned earlier, had been involved in the death of the king's brother Alfred. In spite of that, or perhaps because of it, who knows, King Edward married one of the Earl's daughters, Edith. Alas, the pair were childless, with some sources even suggesting that their marriage was chaste, which is not exactly an ideal situation for the leader of a hereditary monarchy. And to make things just a little bit messier, Godwin despised the Normans, while Edward was half Norman. Remember, his mother was Emma of Normandy. In any case, in 1051, King Edward ordered Godwin to go attack the troublesome town of Dover in Kent, but he refused, openly defying the king. Godwin lost the ensuing conflict and was exiled to Flanders, where he soon gathered new supporters and returned to England, so the king was forced to kiss and make up, probably not literally. Godwin was then reinstated as Earl, but died a couple of years later, leaving his children as important Earls, with one of them being particularly relevant to our story, Harold Godwinson. Remember that name. Or don't, just wait till I tell you more about him. One thing that Edward the Confessor did was rebuild St. Peter's Abbey in Westminster, right next to London. This was the first English church to be built in the Romanesque style and was concluded in 1060, 6 years before the monarch's death. He was buried there himself and was joined 9 years later by his wife Edith. Returning to our story, Edward the Confessor was still childless and his health was becoming a matter of national concern, with various factions making moves in preparation for his passing. But suddenly a tiny glimmer of hope appeared out of nowhere in the person of Edward the Exile, son of Edmund Ironside, and thus first in line to the throne. He had been presumed dead after Cnut the Great exiled him to Scandinavia upon conquering England, but in fact he had somehow managed to make his way to the court of Hungary of all places. In 1056, Edward the Confessor heard the news and recalled him with the intention of making him his heir, to continue the rule of the House of Wessex. Unfortunately, almost as soon as he arrived in England, he died under strange circumstances. That's strange in air quotes because, as we said earlier, there were several parties interested in taking the crown and therefore interested in getting rid of him. Then, in 1066, Edward the Confessor died, and that's when the terrible succession mess which had been brewing for a long time finally reached its boiling point. It's time to introduce the contenders of the upcoming Royal Rumble.
And here we go!
First, the Witan decided that Earl Harold Godwinson, brother-in-law to Edward, would be king, although this was by no means a unanimous decision. In fact, his very own brother Tostig went over to the Norwegian monarch Harald Hardrada, seeking an alliance to take the English throne by force. In addition, there was also William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, and a relative, albeit distant, of the king through Emma of Normandy. Moreover, William argued that a few years earlier, while at his court, Harold had sworn not to stand in his way if he was ever in line for the English throne.
He lied.
And that's how this three-way struggle for England began. The Viking king Harald Hardrada disembarked at Northumbria and started to make his way towards York. Several English earls tried to stop his advance, but Harold defeated them at the Battle of Fulford and occupied the Northumbrian capital. At this point, the official King of England, Harold Godwinson, had no choice but to travel north from London to repel the invaders. Harold's army made it there so fast that they managed to catch the enemy by surprise, falling on them at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. As its name indicates, a crucial part of this battle took place on a bridge, where a Viking hero held off the Anglo-Saxon troops single-handedly, giving the invaders time to regroup. But that wasn't quite enough to win the day. The Norwegians were defeated and both Tostig and Harald Hardrada were killed, the latter by an arrow in the throat. Ouch. This stopped the last Scandinavian invasion of England and is considered to mark the end of the Viking Age. Everyone take off their historically inaccurate horned helmets as a mark of respect. At this point, the English were pleased because they had resolved one of their battlefronts, but they didn't have time to celebrate or even to recover, as they still had to deal with William the Conqueror, who was preparing to attack from Normandy. The chronicles say that William felt entirely optimistic because, while he was waiting for the right time to cross the English Channel, he saw Halley's Comet and interpreted it as a good omen, which of course makes one wonder, did he think it was like a private comet showing just for him? Because if his opponents could also see the comet, who was it intended to be a good sign for?
I hadn't thought of it that way.
In any case, William and his knights disembarked in England and promptly began to take over everything they came across until Harold Godwinson arrived to stop them. That's when both sides faced off at the Battle of Hastings, considered to be one of, if not the most important battle in English history. The development of this battle is chronicled by several sources and, as you would expect in that situation, there are multiple contradictions. Nevertheless, most of them agree that the English formed a defensive shield wall at the top of a hill while William's forces attacked, trying to break their formation. However, the Normans were beaten back again and again, so instead they faked a retreat. Sneaky. The ruse worked and the English gave chase, seeking to finish off the invaders, but that was their undoing. The Norman cavalry appeared by surprise, surrounded them and began to mow down the English. Then came the crucial moment. As Harold's troops were starting to break up, William's archers arrived and peppered them with arrows. According to the story, although this is by no means certain, Harold Godwinson was killed when one of those arrows struck him in the eye. After the battle, William's Norman army made their way to London. The English clergy and nobility had elected as their king Edgar Ætheling, the son of Edward the Exile, but the poor lad had very little support, and when William arrived, he had no trouble taking over the city and being recognised as the new King of England on the 25th of December 1066, at Westminster Abbey. Thus, despite having just 10,000 soldiers against an entire country who viewed them as unwelcome invaders, William the Conqueror became the first English king of the Norman dynasty, whose history we will cover in the next video.
And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.